Notes before we get underway, just to say all mobile phones, please. I'm sure you're used to this and you're probably bored of hearing of it, but it's probably for the umpteenth time. Can you just make sure they're off or on silent? Another thing is that this is a televised debate. It can be seen on Bloomberg in the next couple of weeks at the weekend, so just there as a programming note. And towards the end, we'll take some questions from the floor, of course. So I'd appreciate it if you actually gave your name and indeed which organization you are from. Right, so welcome everybody, ladies and gentlemen. Just to say that this time last year, I was with Omar actually. We were in WEF, World Economic Forum event in Jakarta. It was very similar to this one, what we were talking about. And just to say, I started off then with an anecdote about Jamie Dimon, and Jamie Dimon's daughter asked him once what a financial crisis was. And he looked at her and he said, darling, it's something which happens every 7 years. I mean, it seems like things haven't really moved on. This one keeps on dragging on. And Asia, of course, is not at all immune from what happens abroad. So we've got Greece, as was then at the WEF in Jakarta, very much on everybody's radar. Spain seems to have joined that. And on top of that, we've had recent economic growth figures out of the US showing that, well, growth remains unconvincing. Today's PMI data out of China is showing that everything's not really particularly hunky-dory there either. So, well, this does present, of course, huge challenges for ASEAN. And they have this goal, of course, of having this common market by 2015. And it's, emblematic, really, to have such an ambitious target of, well, the path that the region has gone down since the crisis of 1997. And so this is what we're here really to talk about. How do we integrate the financial architecture of this part of the world? Of course, this is going to be key for everything from healthcare, education, and of course, very importantly, infrastructure as well. So it's about, of course, building these capital markets as well. And of course, this is exactly what we're here to discuss. And let me just make some introductions. And first up here is Omar Lodhi. He is from Abraaj Capital. Next to him, the Deputy Prime Minister of Thailand, and he's, of course, Kittiratt Na-Ranong. Joseph Stiglitz, Columbia University, small matter of a Nobel Prize in economics. Karin Finkelston is from IFC, the International Finance Corporation, and last and by no means least is Jaspal Bindra, who is the Chief Executive of Asia for Standard Chartered Bank. And it is with you, Jaspal, that you have the pleasure of taking it away for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Rashad. Firstly, I think there is a huge incentive for the ASEAN bloc to be created. Clearly, what will be the result of a unified ASEAN 10-country bloc would be a very large and diversified economy. It will have an abundant workforce of 600 million people. It will create ample FX reserves, which will then help in the currency and monetary stability. And the good starting point on it is that actually between the 10 countries, there are no major territorial disputes. So it is a very good starting point. And the only way they're going to be able to compete with their big neighbors, China and India, is not by one country at a time, but as a unified bloc, they obviously count. There are obviously certain barriers, and I think the top of mind 3 barriers are: there is a lack of compulsion mechanism, there's lack of funding for some of the key initiatives, and some of the infrastructure is clearly missing. I don't want to say this in a kind of the wrong way, but I think there are a few instances where the skill sets in some states within their ministries is somewhat not as aligned, maybe. It may be the right word. And clearly there's a huge business perspective for this because, if you can get people to move freely of the skilled sets between these 10 countries, and you can get a bond market in the local currency developed and create for the SME a ASEAN Credit Bureau and risk trade insurance financing. I mean, there is a lot of room for it. And, we have a lot of learning to take from Europe. So there's a good starting point on that as well.
Starting point then also for Karin.
Yes, thank you very much. I think when you look, as Jaspal was saying, at ASEAN being sandwiched somewhere next to, in between India and China. There's a huge amount to be said for creating one bloc. But I think there is also a challenge in that the national policies in several of these countries they're not necessarily aligned. They're different political systems, different stages of development. So I think there are challenges which we're seeing play out in Greece in a set of countries which you could have argued were potentially more at a similar stage. Having said that, looking at what happened in 97, 98 in Asia, I think one thing that ASEAN, and I don't think it was an ASEAN initiative, I think maybe it was an imperative nationally by the countries, took on regulation, especially in the financial sector, the banking sector, which has well insulated them in this crisis, the 2007-2008 crisis. So I think that's something that would be interesting for ASEAN to learn from, is sort of looking at where they can share best practice as a bloc in order to bring up the standards of the entire bloc and then the prosperity, stability across the bloc. So two areas that I would focus on, one would be infrastructure, which Jaspal also mentioned. There are countries such as the Philippines, which have started to do a lot with PPPs, public-private partnerships. We just advised on the Central Java IPP in Jakarta. I think what we need to do is learn from some of these successes in the public-private partnership arena and start to share these lessons with the countries that are not as far along in their infrastructure development. I also think it's important that ASEAN decides where the roads and railroads in ASEAN go, instead of having China decide where the roads and railroads go across ASEAN. Another thing that's interesting about looking at the ASEAN financing is a lot of the syndicated money has been coming from Europe for infrastructure finance. And this isn't as sustainable any longer as it has been in the past. And there's a lot of liquidity here. So we've been trying to get ASEAN banks, Singaporean banks, Malaysian banks, as well as the ASEAN +3 banks from Korea, Japan, to finance more of the long-term infrastructure here. But again, as Jaspal mentioned, I think the answer for infrastructure ultimately is going to be the bond markets. And I know the ASEAN +3 has had initiatives around the bond markets. We're not seeing enough progress. So somehow we need to kickstart this, and maybe the ASEAN +3 plus some of their member institutions need to get involved and move this forward. The second area, I'll be quick, is inclusion, which is probably more important. There are parts of ASEAN growing at very high rates, admirable rates when you look globally, but there are pockets of poverty and pockets of backwardness, as we've heard about. So how do we get more financing to SMEs? How do we get more financing to SMEs owned by women? I think credit bureaus, payment systems, secure transactions frameworks, these are things that some of the ASEAN countries are starting to put in place. I think this could be something that could be taken across ASEAN. And then finally, ASEAN is one of the regions with the most significant potential climate change impact from manufacturing countries such as Vietnam, but also one that will have to adapt the most when the waters rise. So then there's green credit policies that I think people need to look at, the Equator Principles for the banks of ASEAN. There's not one ASEAN bank is in the Equator Principles. I'm partial to them because we founded them, but I think they're important for the people of this region. Thank you.
Joseph Stiglitz.
Yeah, I agree with the view that there are enormous benefits to the creation of the Asian community. But I think I want to highlight the importance of having the right institutional framework. Europe benefited a great deal from European integration, but they're now suffering because they didn't get some of the details right. And you can suffer a lot, even with good intentions. And let me just comment on a few of the aspects. One of the things that we learned from the crisis of 2008 was that the countries, India and China, that did not have independent central banks did a lot better than the United States and Europe that had a central bank. So the notion that independent central banks were the right way has been called into question. Moreover, the institutional framework that was put forward, self-regulation, was clearly wrong. And I mention this because a lot of times there's a notion that we ought to have propagate best practice. And sometimes our view of best practice may not be right. That is to say, it's affected by our current fags and not really based on a deeper analysis of the problem. The second point, and it's related, It is going to be important for the Asian countries to collaborate, to have a coordinated, harmonized regulatory structures, but it's also going to be very important to have the right regulatory structures. And the wrong regulatory structures could be destabilizing. And again, what happened between in the late 90s and the first period of this century, where the IMF and the Financial Stability Board advocated deregulation, self-regulation, capital market liberalization, financial market liberalization, all policies which contributed to the economic downturn and to instability because they weren't done in the right way. The third point, which is related to this, is that in the aftermath of the 2008 crisis, everybody said we have to fix the banks and the financial institutions and make sure they go back to their main task, which is providing finance to SMEs, to enterprises. But what we just learned about in the case of JP Morgan, they didn't do that. They continue to lack of transparency, the uncertainty about what would happen if Greece defaulted, proprietary trading that puts taxpayers' money at great risk. So if you go through the list of what people wrote down in 2009 needed to be done and what was done, we've only gone about halfway. And the problem is when you have big gaps, it can have very serious consequences for stability. The final point I want to make has to do, really echoes the point that Karin made, which is the need for finance, particularly for the poorer parts of the region. And here, let me put forward an idea, which is the creation, the need for an ASEAN development bank. And in other parts of the world, sub-regional development banks have played a very important role. For instance, in Latin America, there's the Andean region has its own development bank called CAFE, which is extraordinarily effective, has a higher credit rating than any of the countries that are a member of ASEAN. And that kind of an institution could help provide some of the finance that addresses some of the needs of long-term development, small and medium-sized enterprises. One of the things that one has to recognize is that traditionally commercial banks have focused on trade credit, on short-term credits, and development requires to a large extent longer-term credits than banks have been willing historically to provide. The bond market is one way of doing it. Creating a development bank is another.
Minister?
Well, listening to the earlier speakers really remind me of the good old days, bad old days, actually, the ASEAN economic crisis, what we call Tom Yam Goong crisis back in 1997. Actually, before that crisis, I had served the financial service industry in almost every corner, started a commercial bank and switched from the bank to capital market, from sell side to buy side, from local to international. I could say that I have seen them all, and if only already in the past 15 years, but it's still there. I think for me, my humble opinion about this is we have to remind ourselves that we should go back to basic. For me, I think financial service industry role and primary responsibility is to support the activities in the real sector. And I try to recommend the idea that we should go back to basic and try to understand the term balanced better than we paid attention to, and perhaps to be less obsessive about growth might be the way that we should look at the economy and also the financial service sector into the future. Why I'm saying this, I think I have seen many spots around the world that many times that financial service sector try to develop itself in a too advanced way and push forward certain economies in a way that creates some they call efficiency, but I think they put themselves into risk. The role of financial service for me, I think it should run, pace itself very well parallel to the real sector. Not too fast, not too slow. And if it's too slow, of course, no, it's stop the progress in the real sector. I have seen the situation around here, and it happened because of the financial service sector that put the interruption in the economic development. Perhaps similar to the situation we've seen in the West in 2008, 2009, and many times that global economic crisis, regional economic crisis, started from the financial service side rather than on the real sector side. However, that's not all the case. We have seen imbalance somewhere, for example, the imbalance of trade, imbalance of the current account, imbalance of payment, then create the crisis too. So if you try to go back to basic with the idea that balance, stability, and also the role of financial service sector to pace itself well with the real sector. Now coming back to Southeast Asia or ASEAN, we learned our lesson, very painful lesson from 1997. That's how and why many economies in this region are very well prepared. I'm not saying that we will be fully immune, but we are very well prepared. However, if you look at ASEAN, you may be able to split ourselves or ASEAN into two groups. The first 5 or 6 older members, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, Philippines, including Brunei, while we have the other 4 new members who are less developed in both real sector and financial service sector. And we are trying to work together because we know that it's the right moment that we will hold our hands together and then become more prosperous together. But ASEAN has got enough flexibility to understand that the new 4 members that we call them CLMV, Cambodia, Myanmar, Laos, Vietnam, they need more time and they need help from the other stronger economies. And that's what we are doing, approaching the ASEAN AEC 2015.
Omar.
Well, it's tempting in light of Europe right now to think less integration is better than more. But I think, especially given the lessons that we can learn, as Karin said, from Europe, the goals set out for ASEAN 2015 today are even more important to achieve and to reach by 2015, especially in lieu of the headwinds that we are seeing from Europe, from US, from a possible slowdown in China, given the fact that we as a bloc are still dependent and coupled with these Western countries. 30% or so of our exports are still to the US and Europe. 1/3 of FDI flows still come from US and Europe, and hence we are exposed. And the integration of our markets through free flow of trade, investment, labor, services is key to boosting intra-ASEAN trade and investment and mitigating a slowdown otherwise that we are going to face in terms of economic growth. But as several speakers have alluded to, there are several challenges, what the minister was saying in terms of the disparity of the different countries, in terms of income levels, education levels, the lack of common standards, regulations, laws. The need for regulation is all the more important today in terms of the headwinds we are facing. National regulators need to sort of come up to speed to tackle a more integrated world, but we also need a regional supervisory body, as Joe was perhaps alluding to as well, with supranational powers, targeting not just microprudential risk, but systemic risk, which we know all too often over the last 4 years has caused and wreaked havoc in all of our economies. So there's a lot of work to do, and as a private sector investor, we are obviously very bullish on ASEAN, but there's a whole lot of skepticism out there whether those targets for 2015 are going to be achieved on time, and whether the political will and a coordinating body which is empowered is sufficiently in place today.
Thank you, everybody. Just one of the reasons why the Eurozone does continue is because of the deep political will, and Omar Lodhi just alluded to that, and whether that exists in this part of the world. We had Jaspal talk about perhaps a level of mistrust which is prevalent as well. Minister, I just want to ask you, deepening capital markets are going to need to get over that mistrust. You're going to need these deeper capital markets in order to be able to fund the roads and bridges that are needed, the schools, etc., and facilitate the trade that is necessary here. And of course, as Joseph Stiglitz was mentioning, a ASEAN Development Bank, Omar was mentioning, of course, here, to perhaps going deeper than that and having a supranational body as well. How close or how real is the desire for all this?
It's not very easy to answer. Actually, I would have to say that the point that ASEAN economies are very different is very interesting. Some of us are smaller, some of us are bigger in terms of population, but per capita income is much, much lower. So the difference of the ASEAN members is another challenge. And at the same time, some of the members are surplus countries. Some of the members are not. And some already an advanced economy that already reached the so-called service economy, for example, Singapore. And then while we still have some economies that hasn't even started the early steps of industrialization. So when you pose the questions, how would we handle it, it's not very easy to answer it as one answer that fit all the economies. However,
isn't that the fundamental problem, though?
Well, yes, if we handle the difference well enough, it could be very complementing one another. But if we don't, like, we try to push the single standard for all the economies, then we would be creating a serious problem. And I believe that ASEAN realized this fact, not only on the economic side. We know that we are different. We're not speaking the same language, with certain exceptions like Lao and Thai. We don't really share the same religions. We don't really have similar cultures in many ways. But we really realize that we can live together, and we are sharing the strength of one economy to the others. And then we're not going to close the ASEAN by ourselves. We are ready to working with outsiders. So everything combined of what you raise would have to be best handled in order to fit each and different economy as well.
Yeah, one of the things one should remember, another area where there's a lot of economic cooperation is the North American Free Trade Area. Very big differences between the incomes, economy of the United States and Canada on the one hand, and Mexico on the other. I think one of the strengths of ASEAN is its diversity. And one of the mistakes, you might say mistakes, the framework of Europe was all conditioned on a kind of convergence rather than a respect for the diversity.
Like EFTA would be the other corollary of that.
Yeah, so the problem is that, I mean, the advantage of ASEAN, as I see it, is that it's recognized this diversity and is trying to build on that diversity rather than to suppress the diversity. And I think that's a very fundamental philosophical difference.
Yeah, I think it's interesting what you're saying about NAFTA and the trade agreements, because I think that's something, what I would encourage ASEAN to do is to work on, not try to take the whole collaboration or the whole integration in one step, but kind of go step by step across areas that are palatable to everyone, and where everyone, as Joy is saying, from their diversity and the way they can contribute, can benefit. I think, it's interesting, I've been sitting here coming from a multilateral development institution with very diverse shareholders who have different agendas and changing agendas. I was trying to think about an ASEAN bank, and then I was thinking about my friends from the Asian Development Bank. I don't know if they're in the room, but I just think, from my standpoint, I would just question whether another development bank is the answer, or if it's founded, Minister, we will work with it, partner with the ASEAN Bank. But I wonder if working within existing institutions and getting the ASEAN private financial institutions to participate more in the longer-term finance and the small business finance would be a better way, if we could get them catalyzed somehow to be more involved.
Actually, Joe wants to respond. Let's just quickly hear from you.
Let me say that the infrastructure needs, the other financial needs of ASEAN are very significant. And so I don't view it as a competition. Now, if the world were different from the current world and the United States were willing to recapitalize the World Bank more, we might be in a different world. But unfortunately, the way where the United States is there are, you might call, political constraints that make it very difficult for significant recapitalization. Given that, it seems to, and also changing the governance of the World Bank. You know, the world has changed a lot, but the World Bank had difficulty, or, you know, it said the G20 agreed that the new president of the World Bank would be chosen on the basis of merit, and I think there's a broad consensus that it was chosen on the basis of the American influence. And so there's still a long way to go in reforming governance of the World Bank and other international institutions. It makes a lot of sense to me for ASEAN to get together and to say, look, we have all these reserves, we have all these resources, why don't we be in charge of our own destiny and try to think about what are the kinds of projects that would bring us together, more connectivity. There are road projects, there are a lot of projects, harbor projects. So it seems to me that makes a lot of sense.
Jaspal, you run a bank which is, of course, spread right around this part of the world. I mean, you have first-hand experience of the diversity and how you deal with that in the capital markets, and that's what I was originally asking, and how you deepen them. So what's your view on this?
I think first I would like to say that on the issue of the ASEAN, the way it's planned, I mean, the fact that each country contributes equally, and you're sort of then left to the country that can contribute the minimum, and then everybody, you know, really creates a problem. So in some ways, it tries to avoid the US influence problem that some of the multilaterals might have, but it also creates a paucity of funds. So I think there is a challenge around that. So whether it's a bank or it's another partnership that helps. As far as we are concerned, in Standard Chartered, we feel hugely privileged that we are in 9 of the 10 countries, in excess of 100 years presence in 9 of the 10 countries. And the 10th country we hope to be, we've also started 150 years ago in the 10th country, but we had to sort of get out for a while because of the sanctions in Burma. And now we hope to re-enter Myanmar as soon as the sanctions are off. My view really is that there is a huge need. If there was one thing that we could do only, we would do the local bond market. Because this reliance on dollar funding as the default currency is really much bigger problem than sort of turns out to be in reality. And we really have to find financing, at least intra-regional trade, which is a growing part of the trade within ASEAN, to be done in an alternative currency other than US dollars.
You know, and I agree with Karin that there's so much low-hanging fruit. You know, it's complicated, right, with all the sort of the Indochina countries, Myanmar, the disparity in income levels, and we should acknowledge that, you know, full integration with them is not going to happen anytime soon. There's a lot of work ahead. But the low-hanging fruit in terms of boosting consumption spending, boosting fiscal spending through much-needed infrastructure where there's a lack of regulatory parameters and enabling environment allowing private sector investment to come in. The capital markets that Jaspal was alluding to, intra-ASEAN flows, portfolio flows, were 11% of total flows, financial assets in 2001. They're 12% today. Now, that surely is a staggering statistic which can be improved. Bond markets, which are there, which are much needed to mobilize savings to boost infrastructure funding, today are 43% of GDP, compared to 260% in the US or 150% in Europe. So these are all initiatives which can be worked on today and where there shouldn't be any impediments to achieving progress.
Finance Minister, what are you going to do about it?
Well, before we jump to that, I'd like to make a remark that when we talk about the development of the financial services sector in ASEAN, I think, you know, we should include the other 3 members called ASEAN plus 3. And that includes China, South Korea, and Japan. And in the past, it's proven that in the 1997 crisis, the other East Asian economies, especially South Korea, could not really get away from the problem that happened in Southeast Asia. And that's why ASEAN Plus 3 really form ourselves into a closer club than perhaps on the goods and services side. And we have some initiatives like Chiang Mai initiative on multilateralization, because we felt that the crisis in the future may come. And of course, we realize that we are all the member of IMF, but we may need to discuss more among ourselves and see what we can do for ourselves by ourselves too. Of course, we have only a small portion of the link decision that whenever we could jump in and help our members without following the advice of the IMF, because we need to have more confidence and understand what we can do. Now, the development of the financial sector in ASEAN will very much depend or rely on the discussion of the +3 members too. And I don't think we need another development bank, because if you try to recall in early days of the ADB, right, it was formed by targeting these economies in ASEAN as the area that they really want to develop and help. That's why the headquarters of ADB is where they are now, right? I think as of now, the stronger economies of the ASEAN +3 realize that they should work closer with ADB to support the other young and upcoming members. That's why we also form ourselves not only to set aside the international reserve to form the line of the credit, but also we have formed the ASEAN Infrastructure Fund that we really send in from our budget. The larger economies agree to send more. The smaller economies like Myanmar agree to participate at the level they can. And the funding, majority of the funding will go to the young and upcoming members, ASEAN members. That's how we're going to arrange for ASEAN.
Omar wanted to jump in.
Minister, if I may, the Chiang Mai initiative, it's $120 billion. Again, the funding issues, it's small.
Double now.
Double that. Is it?
It's double that now? Okay. You've got the linkage with the IMF, where IMF sort of needs to be in the absence of which there's only a 20% drawdown. Is it today in a workable situation so that faced with another crisis, are we going to be able, are we in sort of in safe territory?
Well, we haven't even spent the first cent, but we know that we need to get closer, get bigger with this agreement. That's why we decided to double it in the last meeting when all of the finance ministers of ASEAN +3 meet. And we are planning to increase the portion that we can make decision of our own soon. And I won't be surprised in a few years' time we would decide to increase the size of it even much larger than we are now.
Well, from an economist's viewpoint, how does that help?
Well, the point I was going to make is to second the view that the institutional design, this restraint with the IMF, made it unpalatable to many countries. And that was why in the 2008-9 crisis, nobody drew, there was very little drawing upon it because they just didn't want the IMF in there. So I think there has to be an institutional design, a change in institutional design. Now, obviously, the first order of business is to make sure you don't have a crisis, and that requires having the right regulatory framework of the kind of thing that was referred to earlier. But if you have the wrong institutional framework, which I think Europe does, they're creating firewalls, but they're throwing kerosene on the fire through their austerity measures. So if you don't have the right institutional framework, the firewalls are not going to work. So I think it is a good thing. I think they ought to strengthen it, go towards the Asian Monetary Fund kind of idea. But I think they'll have to rethink some of the constraints that make it less useful than it should.
Jaspal.
I'd just like to go back to the minister's mention of the ASEAN +3. I think that's hugely welcome, particularly from the point of view of the funding paucity. I think the +3 can bring in the funding and the research assistance, etc. The challenge I have with these fancy acronym blocks coming up is that there is one, the United States is building with all of Asia minus China, and then there is a Japan, Korea, China, and they all seem to be in conflict with each other because they all seem to be prioritizing exactly the same bilateral partnership, and that's not going to happen. I mean, just imagine Japan, Korea, and China agreeing on something common given their traditional challenges. I mean, these are all 10, 20-year plans, and to some extent, you know, the larger you make the bloc, even though it has all the inherent benefits of getting the +3, I think just makes it a little bit of a longer-term thing.
Karin, isn't, you know, ASEAN +3 just, I think we're veering off the subject here, but it doesn't actually just, well, destroy the notion of ASEAN itself?
Yeah, I think that's a fair comment, but I think, as the minister has said, it's hard to ignore the +3, because obviously when you look at Asia and where there's huge liquidity, the impact, I think that also we have to avoid if the reliance on Europe and the United States, you know, trading that for China. I think we're seeing over the past couple of weeks that, you know, as the Chinese economy potentially slows down, you know, it also offers big challenges to ASEAN. On the other hand, if China can change their development model to be more consumption-oriented, shed some of the lower scale manufacturing and put that into places like Myanmar, places like Vietnam, that obviously helps ASEAN. So I think the relationship is, you can't ignore it. But I do think, what I think would be important about the ASEAN +3 bond initiative and the funds that the minister's talking about is how can we get those things to go in and catalyze more private sector funding instead of having the government lead it all. I think part of what's driven ASEAN, driven Asia, has been the private sector. So
crowding it out.
Well, we don't want the government to come in and crowd out. We should tap and catalyze the private sector, both at the higher end, but then get the banks to go down market. Fund the small businesses. Fund the women-owned businesses.
Yeah, what I want to say is that one concept here that may be useful is what's sometimes called variable geometry. The notion that there should be a closer integration on a lot of issues within ASEAN. I think ASEAN is an important concept. But there are certain issues where it pays to go beyond that, and ASEAN +3. So in some of the areas, it will be a wider area, but there still ought to be a focus, a great deal of focus on ASEAN itself. Let me just respond a little bit to Karin's comment, though. I think that one shouldn't take the private sector as magic. I think one needs, obviously, a balance. One of the problems in the past with public partnership were that too many of them were where the private sector took the profits and the public sector took the risk, particularly the downside risk. And that was sort of manifested when we had in the crisis where we had the kind of outcome that we did. So it seems to me that one has to be very careful, and that the kind of PPP that India had with the Enron was really very bad. We've learned from the bad ones, but we have to keep a balance and make sure that there's appropriate oversight of the public.
Your response, Finance Minister.
Well, I still believe that on the trade in goods, trade in service, we perhaps still have the situation with the whether +3 would be joining the club as tightly. However, on the financial service side, can't avoid the fact that it's actually ASEAN +3. And perhaps, to be fair, maybe, it's even +5, because if I try to include Taiwan and Hong Kong. And actually, there's some effort by Hong Kong to come in as the +4 officially dialogue member. But, ASEAN still discuss that, we are not sure that we would like to do this, or else we will confuse ourselves. But in reality, the +3, including the other two Chinese, actually in a part of the discussion, whether formal or informal. Then the idea about whether it's a government or the development bank or private, I agree with the idea that we would hope that private sector would play an important role. However, in early days, it's unavoidable to expect the government to step in first with, of course, the support from the development bank. Let's assume that as soon as we've seen the U.S. lifting of the sanction in our friends in the West, Myanmar, I'm sure that the private sector would say, okay, we are very ready to go, but where would be the logistic infrastructure where would be certain projects that we can't really generate immediate economic return as required by the private sector. We need some help from the government, whether their own government or government of the neighboring country or the development bank to go in. So early steps, we need that to roll the wheel. And then after that, I'm very positive that the private sector would be very important.
I agree. I think the key for, I fully agree that the PPPs or private participation in infrastructure doesn't always work. But I think we've seen models in this region. If you look at Manila Water, where the coverage of water, incentive payments to get people to distribute water to poor neighborhoods, and not just relying on the wealthier payers for water services, have worked well. I think if we get the frameworks right, similarly, the private sector role in the privatization of power in the Philippines has also really changed that market in terms of coverage and reliability. I think what would be great for ASEAN is to look at the frameworks that are working and then to try to replicate those across the countries. Because I think that's what the minister was referring to with the 4 newer members. But I think it can go deeper in looking at what's working in some of the countries and then sharing that across.
I want to basically bring this to the floor now. We've got about 15, 20 minutes to go. And just any questions, if you'd like to just identify yourself, of course, as I said earlier, and also the organization you're from. And perhaps who you'd like to address the question to. Do we have any takers? We've got the gentleman here on the second row, first of all. Here, if you can name yourself.
Thank you. My name is Tai Hui from Standard Chartered. We mentioned about the disconnect between the savings in Asia and the lack of investment in infrastructure in Asia. Local market or capital market seems to be one of the disconnects. What about the role of political stability and policy consistency? And what could be overcome? Or what measures could be taken to overcome such issues?
Do you want that to your boss?
To the minister.
The whole panel.
To the minister.
Well, I do accept that everybody here in this room, I'm sure that you all agree that political stability is very important, and the consistency of the policy is extremely important for the private sector to make decisions whether they want to join the club or join the camps, right? When we can see some good stability somewhere, like in Indonesia, I think they have done a very good job. In Philippines, they're doing much better. And there are some other members who are trying to stabilize our political situation. And that's perhaps why and how some other new members realize the fact that when they really want to deliver well-being to their own people, whether for the voters, if they are already extremely democratic, that's one thing. But I think it's important to see political stability and consistency in policy.
But if I could just add, I mean, from where we sit, there is perhaps too much capital looking for investment opportunities in this region. Indonesia, case in point right now, flavor of the month. I don't think people are concerned about political risk. I think they take a long-term view. I think they've realized that Indonesia and, of course, all the other countries have turned the corner. There will be political stability years to come. The economic reform program will remain in place. But it's the enabling environment today, the regulatory environment, concessions, rights of ways, permits, et cetera, which just take forever and have created a bottleneck and a stenosis in terms of that spending coming to the fore.
Yeah, let me just add that one of the problems in the past has been that capital often goes to support a credit bubble. And you need to have a regulatory environment to prevent those credit bubbles. And that's probably one of the most important sources of macro instability. The largest instability arises historically out of these credit bubbles, which arise from a failure of regulatory control. The other problem I just want to highlight is the failure of so many markets, financial markets, capital markets, to allocate capital to areas where it's most productive. And I feel that very intensely as an American, because I watched and saw America's financial markets allocate the capital to create a housing bubble when there were so many needs all over the world. And you saw those important needs, and that's not where the capital was going. So there has to be some framework, part of the regulatory framework, to channel the capital to where it's most socially productive.
Gentleman at the front, if you'd like to identify yourself.
Khalid Janahi from Vision 3. This question is actually to our Nobel laureate here, Joseph. I mean, this morning we've been hearing about jobs. We need jobs, 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 the keynote speak. We talk about we have substantial capital waiting to invest. We talk about that we have savings here. I think if we learn, we talk about Greece, let's talk about another country which has not been accepted into the European Union, which is Turkey. Turkey has been a successful story for the past 15 years. And I think a backbone of any economy, it's not a question of just political stability. You got to have what we call the middle class. There is lack of middle class in this part of the world, as it is in lots of parts of the world which are economically and politically they're not working well. So how can we learn from somewhere like Turkey to basically establish the middle class and proper sustainable middle class? Okay, we talk about infrastructure, we talk about other investments. How do we create a sustainable middle class in this part of the world?
Well, I think you put your finger on an extraordinarily important problem, which is the growing inequality in most countries around the world. A few countries where things are getting better. Interestingly, the countries where inequality was the worst, Latin America, like Brazil, have gotten better because they looked over the precipice and they saw where things were going, and they quite honestly, I think they got frightened. But in an awful lot of countries, most countries, things are getting worse. I chaired a commission of experts looking at the global financial crisis, and we identified one of the sources of the crisis was the growing inequality inside America, which was, there was an attempt to offset the effect by creating a credit bubble. But of course, that just made things worse. So there are lots of things that one can do to try to create more equality, to stop this trend. It's not just the inevitable consequences of market forces. Some countries have been more successful than others. And so one example, for instance, is progressive taxation. Another one is regulatory frameworks that encourage lending to small and medium-sized enterprises that give opportunity. Another one is government programs to support education that make sure that you had an educated labor force that is able to take the new jobs that are being created. But it really takes concerted government action focused on the issue of inequality and as you said, jobs.
I would just add that in terms of middle class, I mean, the figures that I have globally, if you took a very conservative estimate of how you define middle class, it's about 1.8 billion people in the world are in the middle class category. That is expected to rise between now and 2030 to 4.9 billion. And 85% of that delta of 3 billion is going to come in Asia. So I don't think so there's going to be any shortage of middle class. In fact, consumption is going to be the challenge, which will lead to wars on water and food and all of that stuff, largely being caused from the consumption explosion here. I think the challenge is going to be on the supply side.
Lady on the second row here.
Hi, my name is Annalisa Balares. I'm a young global leader, CEO of Women's Sphere, a global entrepreneur based in New York, originally from the Philippines. And my question is, loans are one form of financing. I'd love to get your thoughts on strategies that ASEAN countries could take to create ecosystems that inspire and enable high-impact entrepreneurship, the type of entrepreneurship that attracts venture capital, angel funding, and that would potentially create the future Facebooks of the world coming from ASEAN countries.
Karin, I think you might have a view on this.
Sure. One thing that we've found in several of the ASEAN countries is more and more domestic fund managers, indigenous fund managers doing just what you're saying. So I think the key is then to tap the equity capital from around the world into these areas. What we've done is put together an asset management company that's taking in money from different sovereign funds around the world, pensions funds, and then trying to channel that on the back of our investments. So we're doing something around not so much venture capital right now, but green capital, green sort of tech, a global fund to sort of harness some of the global liquidity into that area. I think one issue that goes with that, though, is really this issue, as Joe has mentioned, around loans to small businesses. I think in Asia, when you look at what are the banks doing, and the large local banks, they're often lending to the blue chip companies in the country because there aren't bond markets that can pick up that long-term finance, and it's probably an easier risk profile. The other thing that's happening, I think, in Asia is a lot of microfinance. When I look at, a Kleda Bank in Cambodia or Haas Bank, well, this is Asia, not ASEAN, but in Mongolia, there's a lot of good microfinance happening. A lot of Indonesian banks are doing microfinance. I think what's missing is the middle. It's the small businesses and when you graduate from a microfinance institution, it's a much different situation than to go from the card banks in the Philippines into the Bank of Philippine Islands. It's tougher to get your loan proposal across. And so I think what we really need to do is create the incentives either through risk share facilities, through concessionary finance as a first loss that the banks can provide, so that when these angel finance people use all their own capital to start, get a little bit of equity capital, they can actually leverage themselves to grow. And I think that's where we really need to focus. And
well, Omar, you're in this business, aren't you? So
in your country of origin, 85% of the workforce work in the SME sector and only account for 50% of GDP. And the statistics vary, but they're not too different in the rest of ASEAN. The ratio, for instance, in the United States would be 1-to-1. There's a huge productivity gap. And to Karin's point, it is a sector completely starved of credit, starved of bank financing, even on the equity front. We just bought a business, a private equity firm that focuses on the SME space. And the inherent spirit of entrepreneurship in this region is very vibrant, right? They need the capital, they've got the business ideas, they've got the execution prowess, and it's a very, very attractive investment opportunity and space that we invest in, but much, much more is needed. And it could have huge dividends from a productivity and GDP growth standpoint in this region.
Minister, I'd like to ask you, how does Thailand deal with this?
Well, the first point is that money is not everything. Even though you provide the best solution to these nano, micro, small, medium enterprise, it doesn't really mean that they will work. So we have to also work hard on the other side too. So Thailand, we're working with those universities and those colleges in such a way that they will be very well prepared if they really want to become an entrepreneur one day. There are many private groups who agree to fund themselves together and offer the incubation for many schools. The government decided to support this by providing some small budget at the beginning to work with some universities and see whether it works. We are still in early days. In Thailand, we still have some development banks of our own. We call it special purpose financial institution. We have banks for agriculture and cooperatives. We have SME banks, and they're trying to work the best they can. And I still have to accept that we are still in our early days. 10 years ago, the NPLs at SME Bank was very high. And now we can really solve the problem and improve the performance of the bank, which means that we're actually not improving the performance of the bank. We're improving the performance of those borrowers of the bank. And it's very encouraging that we start to know that what else besides money that we have to work with them.
Jaspal, what about your bank?
Well, clearly, Asia has been in some ways an example of what the West is now sort of learning to live with. I mean, there was always this theory that banks in the government sector didn't work. And if you look at the big economies in Asia, they're all largely, the predominance of the banks are public sector. The banks in Asia have always had a core tier 1, capital tier 1 ratio of over 10-12%. And that was something which was far from fashionable in the Western banks. And I think they're sort of being brought to task in getting that done. So clearly, I think having been, with Asia being our home, even though we're EU headquartered, we've had to live with that competition and learn. So in some ways, we got it early and over a gradual pace rather than having to do it in one shock treatment. So we are fortunate having Asia as our home.
I'm going to just now ask everybody just with a degree of brevity, 1 minute each, on what gives you hope for the goal of 2015 and what perhaps leaves you despondent. Let's start off with Joseph Stiglitz.
Well, I think what gives me hope is the excitement that one gets over the discussion of ASEAN, AEC being implemented. I was in Myanmar in February, and it's interesting how in this country that's making a transition, the fact that it will be integrated and take a leadership role is really motivating a lot of the some of the changes that are going on. And to me, I think that really is indicative of the role that it can play in creating not only a dynamic economy, but a dynamic society.
I think what excites me is really I mean, it's been mentioned here, this entrepreneurial spirit, the energy of small micro businesses here. And so if we can channel the credit in the right way, we can get the frameworks right for lending to small businesses, investing in small businesses, investing in women-owned businesses, I think there's a huge amount to be hopeful for. What worries me is the environment, is biodiversity, is the way infrastructure programs will be implemented if we don't get the standards right. And so that's something I think we haven't talked about that much today, but I think it's something we really need to take into account. And I think this is something else where ASEAN can really start to set standards that will make sense for their people over time.
Jaspal.
I think there is sufficient traction on the ASEAN 15 roadmap. So if they can just keep that momentum going with +3, +4, +5, whatever it takes to make it happen, I think that's there. The worry I have is that if the global financial crisis continues in the form it does, people will get to prioritize national interest over the unified bloc interest. And I think that will be the start of the finish.
It's a formidable bloc, 600 million people. Let's face it, and let's acknowledge that they've come a long way in the last 10 years. These economies have done a lot, these countries have done a lot. That generates a lot of optimism. ASEAN 2015 will happen. My only concern is that will it happen by the stated timeline of 2015? And perhaps to make that happen, stronger, more focused execution on the part of all the governments.
Final word from the Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, first of all, you get my confirmation that we won't try a single currency. We believe that exchange rate is a magic factor to help adjust on a competitive advantage. Then what we're trying to do these days is to improve on the financial liberalization, just to see freer flow of financial services and freer flow of capital in early days. And we'd like to confirm to you that the infrastructure that we already work together under ASEAN +3 with the ADB, we'll try to have the financial service and then to support the early days of the development of the younger members of ASEAN.
Omar, Lodhi, Kittiratt, Na-Ranong, Joseph Stiglitz, Karin, Finkelston, Jaspal, Bindra. Please, everybody, thank them.
Thank you.